Well, are we all ready? Do we want to start?
I'm
Think so.
ready.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Sarah Resnick, and I'm the deputy editor of N Plus One. N Plus One is a magazine of literature, culture, politics, and we're published 3 times a year. Our most recent issue, which is out now, is called "Take Care." And if you want to support N Plus One and things that we do, which includes, hosting events like this, you can subscribe. Oh, thank you, Lucy. You can subscribe at www.nplusonemag, that's spelled out.com. Subscribe. The link is in the chat. Thank you, Rachel. And there's also a donate button that you can use. And we usually recommend $5 for events like this. But most of all, we just hope that you'll support the work of the 2 writers who are with us this evening. And so we have Lucy Ives, whose new story collection, Cosmogony. Have I pronounced that correctly, Lucy? I know there was correct. Okay.
Yeah, that's the
That is
pronunciation
correct.
of
Okay,
this
great.
word. Yeah, that we're going with for now.
We're going with it for now. Great. Is so
So
Cosmogony,
far as
insofar as it's the correct pronunciation, it is the occasion for this event. N Plus One recently published Lucy's Scary Sights from this new collection. And Lucy is the author of 2 novels, Impossible Views of the World, which is published by Penguin Press, and Louder Milk, or The Real Poet, or The Origin of the World, published by Soft Skull, as well as a number of books of poetry and sometimes genre-free writing. In spring 2020, Siglio Press published The Saddest Thing Is That I've Had to Use Words, a Madeline Gins reader, which is the first definitive collection of poet architect Gins's poetry and prose, and edited with an introduction by Ives. And we also have with us Renee Gladman, who is a writer and artist preoccupied with crossings, thresholds, and geographies as they play out at the intersection of poetry, prose, drawing, and architecture. She's the author of 13 books of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. At the core of her work is a critically acclaimed cycle of novels about the imagined city-state of Rabica and its inhabitants. N Plus One published an excerpt from 2017's Houses of Rabica in issue 29. Renee has also published 2 art monographs, one Long Black Sentence, and that was indexed by Fred Moten, and also Prose Architectures. So, yeah, please support their work. You can buy their work at any local independent bookstore, or you can order it online from your local independent bookstore. Okay, so yeah, we're here tonight to talk about Lucy's new story collection, Cosmogony. It features 11 stories that make use of the strange and sometimes fantastical. There are demons and angels who appear as romantic interests. There's one narrator who claims to live at the bottom of the ocean, and another one who time travels. And yeah, these stories aren't really set in an alternate world. They exist in a world really that bears a lot of resemblance to our own, certainly the United States in the past 20 years. Insofar as they feature memes, Wikipedia, divorce, tennis, cats, the game of murder, bodegas, Craigslist. So as I was reading these stories, I was wondering, do the demons and angels really exist in the worlds of these stories? Does time travel? Or are the narrators prone to the use of exaggeration or embellishment or metaphor to describe how they perceive the world around them? Certainly, there are stories whose narration is mostly interior, at times even disembodied. There are narrators who are preoccupied with how we know ourselves through other people, or with what knowing other people can tell us about the world. And they are narrators who sometimes indicate that they are aware of their own role as narrators. So it's really a coup to have Renee with us tonight to be in conversation with Lucy. I mean, both because there are just two writers I admire so much. But, you know, while they're singular writers in their own way, they also share a lot in common. You know, they're each fiction writers who don't follow the conventions of fiction. They both share interest in the visual arts. Renee makes drawings, as I already said, which have been published in 2 books so far. And Lucy often writes about art as a critic. They both came up through poetry, but have made sentences the foundation of their writing. And I think in their stories and other writing, they both build sentences around an abstraction or an idea or feeling rather than plot points. So we're going to hear each of them read for a short time. And then afterward, we're going to have a conversation among ourselves before opening it up to questions from the audience. So if at any time you have a question, just put them in the chat and we will get to them eventually. And yeah, so now I will introduce, well, I've already introduced you, but now Lucy will read. And I guess, Lucy, do you want to introduce what you're reading from for us?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to read from the first story that is in the collection just because it's easy to choose the first story. And I don't really, sorry?
Will you just hold the book because I left my copy at my office earlier. Sorry. Thank you. Yay.
There it is. It's kind of shiny also, and it interestingly has different colors on different sides. Yeah, so I'm going to read from the first story, which is called A Throw of the Dice. And as will become apparent, the title is a translation of the title of a poem by Stefan Mallarmé. And that it plays a role in the story, but it plays a role in various different levels. I think everything about the plot of the story that you need to know will be explained by what I read, so I won't say anything further about it. I'll just read it to you. Oh, and I also want to say, Renee, thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm really, really grateful to you. And Sarah, thank you too for hosting. And N+1, thank you for publishing my story. That was really nice of you guys. Okay, so here's the beginning of A Throw of the Dice. And I'll just read for about 8 minutes or something like that. A Throw of the Dice. When we were first married, he went out and bought a ball gag. It wasn't something I asked him to do. He wasn't a tall man, but I suppose he was reasonably strong. He had a construction job at the time. It was the sort of work he claimed to prefer. We were living in San Francisco and through some act of God managed to find an apartment we could afford in an occasionally fancy neighborhood. It was just 2 rooms with a kitchen, the bathroom memorable for its coordinating sink, tub, toilet, and floor-to-ceiling tile, all a click shy of Pepto-Bismol. Outside, in the mornings and at dusk, an oddly shaped vehicle I learned to call the Google bus rolled darkly by. He was up at 5, cycling into the East Bay. Around 7, when a neighbor made her daily foray, the garage door screwed into the ceiling that was also the floor beneath our bed, a mattress, went into action. It was a braying sound accompanied by copious vibration. During this process, I envisioned what I believed to be the exact fashion in which the building would collapse during an earthquake. I saw myself mangled in rubble. I lay, intact within the intact building, in bed, possessed by vertigo. I did not work in tech either. I worked full-time for an employment agency. I had originally gone into temp, but had been hired as the front desk girl. An Australian man with outrageous good looks, benefiting from the immigration policies of President George W. Bush, had hired me, citing my unusual abilities as a typist. Although I insisted that I preferred something with fewer hours, the agency maintained that it was low on contracts, and could I please take them up on this offer, seeing as I was unlikely to receive another. Yes, I said. Great, they replied, wonderful. I am so pleased, announced the Australian, glinting hugely. He really was astonishing, ranching in his family, eyes and teeth like polished rocks. He began telling a long, long story, about his very young wife. I thought all the time about how much I loved him. It would come to me as I was walking down the street. I loved him, the man I was married to, and as well as being afraid of earthquakes, feared that one of us might die in a plane crash or be pulled down by a rogue wave. I thought of meningitis, serial killers, war. Fog rolled up the hill. It was night again. I minced cilantro. We sat at our table by the window and had a beer. He went on several shopping excursions. He returned with bags stuffed with violet tissue. He quietly re-entered the house. It was a Sunday. He restrained me. He was, as I was saying, not a large man. He was a relatively small man, and he was full of a searing rage, an odorless, colorless flame, unknowable to the naked eye. We'd take the BART to a party and pass card tables set up by proselytizing Scientologists, and he would explain that they believed all humans were animated by the souls of aliens long ago subject to genocide. I wanted to take the stress test, but he wouldn't let me. L. Ron Hubbard was like, I'm going to invent a truly stupid religion. Look at these people, he said. He seemed not to want to get too close to them, but I noticed a week later 2 novels by Philip K. Dick in his open backpack, The Man in the High Castle, and The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, Dick having allegedly inspired Hubbard to devise his intergalactic creed. There was something vaguely gothic about Dick, I thought, something sharp and in bad taste. He was paranoid yet flavorful, industrial strength. We had a friend who'd grown up Mormon but renounced the faith at 17 and ran away from home. He'd lived in a basement in Oakland for a few years before going to college, then grad school. He had about 20 tattoos and a gold front tooth and loved antique furniture and cocaine. He and the man I was married to went through a period of binges, and somehow I associated it with Scientology. I listened to them discuss the unusual activities of the angel Moroni and the irony of Abendson's "The grasshopper lies heavy" before we parted ways for the night. They to a fortress maintained by an eccentric dealer on Potrero Hill, I to my translations and, more importantly, Craigslist. There were 2 main things I was doing during the time I was not working at the temp agency, or sleeping, or eating, or experiencing married sex, and these were 1, translating French symbolist poetry, and 2, trawling Craigslist for employment. Specifically, I was interested in Stéphane Mallarmé, whom I considered glamorous as well as difficult. Anyway, it was something I could talk about in mixed company. It was something that got people to leave me alone. She's translating Mallarmé, the man I was married to said. After this, I was left to my own devices and at liberty to navigate over to some listings. When the American poet Frank O'Hara was pretty young, he made a translation of Mallarmé's poem, Un coup de dé. It was something I liked to look at. I could contemplate the nature of fame. This was, by the way, before Meditations in an Emergency appeared in a scene in Mad Men and became, if briefly, a bestseller. O'Hara was one of the few poets the man I was married to had read, and he seemed to have romantic feelings for him. There was, leaning in an alcove near the entrance to our apartment, a bent postcard featuring a black and white photo of O'Hara, one of the only decorative additions to the place not made by me. The man I was married to returned catatonic from his excursions with the ex-Mormon. He tapped his fingertips against his thumb in his sleep and ground his teeth. I got out of bed. It was 2:35 a.m. Beside my computer sat O'Hara's early writing. I admit there's a way I look a little like him. We have the same sad eyes. His translation begins, "A throw of the dice, even when thrown in eternal circumstances in the midst of a wreck, be it that the abysm whitened displays furious." Abysm, I thought. But I was only pretending to think about literature. I was on Craigslist and responding to an ad. I wrote, "To whom it may concern, I am a recent graduate of blank university, 2000 blank, and the University of blank, 2000 blank, who would love to craft some gripping, sentimental, and definitely erotic diary entries for you. Please find a resume and several recent film reviews attached. Thanks. The next day I went to work, and in the evening there came a reply. Hello. Thank you for your interest in our little project. We are developing a small artistic website where we shoot some erotic pictures and erotic videos of a few girls. Each girl has 5 or 6 photo shoots with some video and an interview. We need to create a diary for a few of them. This diary would consist of 2 parts. One, actual blog, e.g. day 1, day 2, etc. Some days should have some connection to the photo shoots, but generally it's a very creative job. The only other condition is that there should be quite a bit of erotic content. 2, also all the photos, and some of them could be repetitive, need some description. However, you can be creative here as well. Your description doesn't necessarily need to describe the picture. E.g., if a girl drinks coffee, you might write something about her memories of the past. If she kisses, you can talk about the texture of her lips, etc., etc. The total work is about 10 pages up or down, 1 or 2. Total pay for one diary is around $100. Website is www.photoconfessions.com, login confessor, password first. It's operating only partially at this point, but you'll get the general concept. Take a look at the timeline on the top of the page that allows you to go over to different entries. Also, it's better to use Explorer than Firefox. Most of the girls need a diary. Please write back if you are interested. Sincerely, Lev. I held my breath. I had that feeling I so often had in high school, as of a tracking shot. Dear Lev, I began typing. I want, I thought that night, to be free, but freedom is an intellectual demand and, as such, has nothing to do with pleasure. Far, far below, there was some sort of silvery substance. I could see it glittering there. Truthful, perhaps eternal. I was not a man. When I was with the man I was married to, I sometimes wanted him to stop. Don't come, he would tell me. Pleasure was a tiny wall in the void, yet the void inhabited it. In the midst of an unspeakable orgasm, I felt panic, then what I believed was the nearness of God. I'll stop there. On that note.
Thank you, Lucy. That was great. Renee?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone that I cannot see. It's really wonderful to be to hang out with you two this evening. I'm excited to talk about all kinds of things. I could have, I was listening to you read that piece, and I was thinking it would make so much sense if I followed with something that was narrative. And it's not that this isn't narrative, but I guess it's not as fictional as it could be. But I've just been really interested in sort of writing things that shape the almost thinking about like the architecture, the kind of arrangement of language as opposed to kind of filling it in. So that's really abstract, but I'm about to read something very abstract. This is a piece about space. It tries to name a series of goings on in an art space, in a kind of like sculptural installation space that I actually wrote for an artist in conversation with photos of his work. I think that I'll just read it. I finally realized that when I was looking at space, space was there because something inside of it was flowing. In fact, space was something cut to something flowing. It was something cut. It was something extending from something cut and something hanging. It was something cut, interrupted by something flowing, and something radiant and fast, slanting across something hollow. Space was something hollow made from something cut, and it was radiant, and it was long. Space was long and dark, and it was radiant. It was cut and large and unknown. It was tiny and radiant. It was radiant and dark. As I stood, I saw something slanting through something cut and something extending into something clearing. And the clearing was full of cuts, and inside the cuts was something full that was also hollow. It was something radiant leaning on something cut. It was something utterly radiant, shaped by something cut against something hollow, hollow inside something crowded with objects that themselves were cuts. Space where something cut to something seeing but unseen, something spreading and shaping without itself a shape. It was something fast and radiant. Space was something cut that was also dark, and it was glowing. I counted something glowing. I counted something hanging and something open. Then I counted something slanting and radiant, something dark. It surprised me to learn that through something dark could be something flowing, that at the end of something flowing could be something cut, and the cut could be both full and hollow. It surprised me that it was dark. While I was looking, I counted something malleable and hanging. I counted something inelastic and squared. I walked a little further and counted something malleable cut by something flowing and edged by something dark. Something dark was vying with something cut to form the edge of something malleable. And it was space that made this radiant. It was also space that showed how something malleable could be both something hanging and something elapsing. It could be something passing as well as something passed through. It could be malleable and cut, and therefore could fold where it was elapsing. In that moment, space was something passing, cut through something holding. And this was not the same as being something flowing, cut through something hanging, or something radiant speeding across something framed, something framing the radiantly empty dark, all that silent speed. Space was something cut, but it was also something passing, an elapsing of something going and a filling in of something dark. It was a heaping of objects cut to something flowing, and was dark inside where it was radiant, and was fast when passing through its own framing. Space, I saw, as it was cut, was also teeming. It had filled up with objects. It was something holding to something broken into parts, something broken to something flowing. The objects were broken and not yet made, or made too far, and were dark and radiant. Space was the radiance of objects in a kind of strained inaction. It formed an edge between something doing and something done, elapsing the moment it became permanent. Space was a hollow of bright edges. It was something hollow cut into something teeming. It was a building in of hollows. It made a clearing that was also elapsing. And this led to my seeing how something extended could become something passing. Space was something still that was also moving and could be radiant and dark at once. Space was something physical cut to something elapsing, and this materialized as something hanging. Space was something hanging that was both radiant and elapsing, something emptied and something folded. I counted something folded. I counted something sprawled. I counted something inelastic. There was a long pause. It was space. Then I counted something malleable. I counted something elegantly inelastic. Then there was a bridge of darkness flowing. I counted something malleable and hanging. I counted 3 framing, cutting clearings that were empty. I counted something flat and something tall with a clearing. Space was above me. I hadn't quite known. I counted a long and very narrow opening cut through something impermeable, and something impermeable holding up something hollow. The whole thing was hollow until it was cut by something hanging, even though the hanging itself was hollow. Space was a series of hollows interrupted by something inelastic, something fast darkening, something flat, something unknown and malleable. Space was something draping that enclosed its own radiance. It was something radiant cut to something glowing of a different tone, something deeper cut to the dark hollow, something orange. In this one moment, space was something orange cut through something malleable and hanging. It gave off a feeling. Space gave off a feeling that it itself was feeling something. The desire of cutting and being cut, the ambition of flowing, the awe of elapsing. Space was something holding, feeling something elapsing, and something dark, and it showed itself as that in a long and narrow way, in an open and clear way, in a vertically disappearing way. Eventually, I arrived at an intersection of my seeing where I was looking out at space at the same time that I was making space by my looking, and I was being pulled into space by having a relationship to what was cut and what was flowing, such that I was also cut and flowing. I was something cut inside something cut, and was a radiance of seeing inside something seen. You change space by looking at it. I've said this before somewhere else, but it was still true. And space changed you by opening to the pressure you introduced into the room, the hallway, the clearing. Space was something pressed, elapsing against something rising. I began to count colors. I counted something brown. I counted something gray. They were all neutral, disappearing colors. Some were sinking into the floor, some rising into the space above me, a space free of objects. Space was something free of objects, but hollowed in a waiting way. It was cut to a clearing and cut to a pulse. It made an impression of folds when in fact it was a rising, pressing, not folding, silent, held, suspended. Space was an inelastic verticality disappearing into the clearing above me. It was something tall rising against something wide. It was an expanse elapsing within something dark and radiant, something breathing and slanted and fast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Sure.
That was so beautiful. Okay, well, which question to ask first? Okay, well, Lucy, one of the narrators in your new collection, she says that sometimes she thinks that narrative can be merely decorative. I thought that was an interesting statement, and I wondered if you could say more about what she means by this. And are the narratives in Cosmogony merely decorative? And I don't know, I guess I'd like to ask Renee whether this description resonates with her or means anything to you too.
Well, insofar as the narrator says this is in the story that is called Ursat's Panda. It's a story about cats. And the narrator is offering one hypothetical situation in which narrative might inhere or appear, and is trying to talk about what she perceives as the difference between life as it is lived and life as it is related in, I guess, conventional fiction. And I think for her, she's speculating that in life, narrative can sometimes be trivialized in a certain way, or she's very interested in the idea that narrative could be trivialized as a kind of coping mechanism, that it could be something that's merely decorative, and she compares it to like a sort of like a paper tail that you might attach to something in a way as like a kind of joke. While at the same time she's talking about how events are very serious for her, but she needs to occupy this position. So that's who that narrator is. But for me as an author, I think I might be less interested in narrative than maybe other kinds of arrangements. And I'm not exactly sure what those are. I'm not sure what their names are exactly, but I like juxtaposition a lot, and I like the idea that a reader can take a kind of like I kind of like to make little, almost like little caves in different places in the story, and I like the idea that the narrator can pass from each one of these sort of stopping points to another, and in that process, they develop a narrative, I guess, for themselves, or a series of kinds of reflections. But I don't know if I would put narrative into a story intentionally. It's something that I guess I would rather have a reader kind of be figuring out, almost like it's a kind of puzzle to figure out what the narrative is. So.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah, so many things I'm thinking. My first sort of thought is that I always get confused about if sometimes when people are using the word narrative, if they mean something else instead, like plot, because I feel so certain, like just in the philosophy of my living, that narrative is just the motion of everything, that you can, um, like just I guess the ongoing of time is is a motor. And so that just describes that things are in flow, or if they are stalled, but within that flow. And so it's hard for me to separate narrative out from anything, especially when language is involved, because it feels very difficult to accumulate language without arriving kind of immediately at some narrative. So that's what I feel like on one hand, and on the other hand, it was really interesting to hear you sort of make those distinctions between the narrator in that story's kind of thinking about narrative, and then yours, which to me felt more like about the mechanical or the architectural kind of shaping of a story, as opposed to being inside of it. And her description of or your sort of articulation of her thought about narrative really sort of was familiar for me in my experience of reading the work, which is reading your book, this book of stories, which is that this sort of relationship between the moment of experiencing difficult or disturbing life situations, and how those things are treated narratively by the person. There's this kind of flattening that sometimes happens, or there's humor. You talked about juxtaposition. It's like I feel like the narrator kind of plays around with what is ordinary, and then like these thoughts or these actions that kind of come in and interrupt that, or like shift it, so that it's especially, or in particular in the first piece, where Mallarmé interrupts, or like the work on Mallarmé, or the document. Anyway, so my point is that it does seem like that's something that's really important to the people in the stories, in surviving or understanding the narratives that they're in. I don't know about the word decorative, but that narrative gets kind of played around in that way.
Yeah. Thank you for that reading. That I think that you're right, that maybe that's part of what that narrator means when she uses the word decorative. That it's something that I'm like, I put the narrative like aside a little bit in order not to be with the sort of with the engine of it as it is given to me. So yeah, that's.
Can I ask you about, do you mind, Sarah, if I ask her?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Because I think that this particular book is occupying a really interesting place for me, sort of fictionally, because while it does have this kind of odd sort of out of timeness, it does have a lot of pointers that make you feel like you're in a kind of alternate ordinary world, like, words like Amazon, or office mates, that kind of thing that makes you feel like you're in an ordinary place. And then I was just really interested in trying to get a sense of what the condition of your narrators are, like what sort of like what what is what kind of like brings them, or makes them kind of emerge out of story space into these spaces that are being sort of relayed to us. And I wanted, if you could talk about that, like is there a kind of temperature, or like a contour of the world, or contemporary living that you feel like you are thinking about, that's really important, that that you sort of are kind of pulling through the pieces in this book?
Yeah. Well, part of the place that the narrators come from is my own fear of the short story, and my sort of inability to write them in a certain way. And so the narrators are also the sorts of narrators that you might find in a certain kind of essay. And they're kind of like, that essay narrator is kind of like brought to the brink of something and just pushed off, or sort of they like have to learn to swim, and they kind of have a set of things that they need to talk about, that they know they need to talk about, but they don't know how they connect. And so their job is to make those things cohere. And I think where all the sort of the neologism, like the contemporary language, comes is in part because many of those words represent things that are, in my opinion at least, intended to make a kind of world cohere, whether we believe that we're currently living under conditions in which a world is possible. Those entities are there to kind of broadcast worldness. And so then they're encountered by this kind of essayistic, or sort of learning as they go story narrator. And that narrator is, I think, sometimes repulsed by them, but sometimes clings to them as familiar entities in the space, the story space that they're in.
Yeah, I feel like those references really do a lot of work in the story, or like in the stories, to those references to play to like the president or Craigslist or whatnot. Because especially for those of us, I guess, who have like lived through those moments, or the moment that we're in, I mean, they do a lot of connotative work with, like, in a very I guess, like, in a very discreet and distilled kind of way. But yeah, I mean, I guess all of these references, I was thinking a lot about, because I guess, Lucy, like, your stories otherwise, like, don't spend a lot of time like describing where your narrator is, for example, or what she's doing in space as she's thinking, and yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like, to what degree both, I mean, that this is really just a question for both of you, but like like the language that you choose for your work, like how much does it correspond to the time period that you're thinking of, and how much is it you know, so Lucy, like the story that you just read from, I mean, there's these references like to President Bush and to Craigslist, and, you know, we can kind of think that it's like around the early aughts, right? And, you know, are you looking for language that's from that time period to you know, sort of lift into the story? And, you know, I wanted to ask a similar question to Renee, just based on the Rabica novels and the fact that you've, you know, completely invented this world, and that the Rabikians actually speak their own language that you also have sort of invented. So yeah, I guess I'm just curious about how like to what degree there's a relationship, I guess, between the space in your stories and the language that you use, if that's not too abstract. I hope. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just say quickly, like for other things that I've written, I have gone expressly and done research to find period language. So I wrote a novel that was set in the early aughts, and I spent a lot of time like reading magazines that were, you know, published in the time, general interest, popular men's magazines, for example, to try to find words that we wouldn't use anymore that have fallen away. And you definitely discover things, events, worlds, spaces when you look at that language and those images that are no longer part of what we do. Even something that this, you know, the early aughts is fairly recent, right? Um, and I've done the same with, you know, the late 19th century and other time periods. But for this story, um, I think it was more about trying to find and slightly different than trying to find period language, than to find language that doesn't that maybe doesn't necessarily belong together, or trying to think about like, well, how can Mallarmé exist in San Francisco, like just after, you know, the bubble or whatever, like what does that look like there, and what does, you know, what are the other literatures that are around. I think Philip K. Dick is an interesting site to pause on, and so there's it's a sort of, it's a less like historically driven thing than, again, just like an interest in juxtaposition and in the sort of like what feels anomalous, but um, has, like once you put Mallarmé into a story, like Mallarmé has a tendency to govern a lot of what happens, even though he, or, you know, there's some discussion about how he plays with identity too, that he doesn't have a place in that world. So
I'm going to answer your question, but I was just thinking, because it's not just the words that kind of like let you know what period you're in, that I am really noticing in the work. And when you keep saying juxtaposition, I keep thinking about, I don't think you read, did you read about the Boston creams in your excerpt, Lucy? Did
no,
you read
that's
that?
later. Yeah.
I just want like this quick paragraph where it says, I would go sometimes to the 24-hour donut shop on the hill above our apartment. It wasn't a fancy place, but the Boston creams were good and it had seating. It was owned by a family who didn't seem optimistic about the state of the world, but they knew a lot of people who came in and maintained a supportive tone. It was a place where I could go to mourn. And so to me, it's more like I'm interested in your use of these different registers that first set up the first sentences before it was a place where I could go to mourn, felt like a really different kind of place that I was in. I was sort of like being lulled into this kind of slightly, quirky story about like a person's routine, and then this sentence sort of gets used as a way to kind of like turn the paragraph a little bit, and I think that I felt really sort of compelled by your use of these kind of intervening sentences that do that shift. And it was funny hearing you talk about preparing to write your novel about the aughts, the early aughts. I feel like I'm the exact opposite in the sense that I don't, I love to research in the sense that I love to find the books that need to sort of like be in a stack next to me, or that I just need to own and have in my library, or like maybe I will open and I will find words that sort of lead me somewhere. But I'm not a very good researcher. I am just utterly not there with research. And so in a way, fiction is wonderful because I can just make up, the stuff that I need to go there. We were talking about math earlier before we started, and I really love the look of math, and love sort of the idea of what it can do when I'm thinking about drawing or thinking about writing. But I make it up. I make up my equations because I actually have no idea. We were talking about algebra. Algebra was like one of the hardest. I got like super depressed as a person once we had to start to learn algebra because I just didn't know where we were anymore. So in Ravika, a lot of that is about sort of, obviously I'm full of everything I've read and everything I've seen, and having ideas about like what Ravik should sound like or what the place should sort of be based on. And doing quick internet researches of like what's some words from Romania. But for me, it's really like I'm trying to get back to the writing with as much kind of material as I can get. But yeah, preparing for that is it's not as high on my list. It's sort of like trying to improvise or kind of like invent a way to move forward.
Lucy, you're nodding vigorously. Do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, I guess I was just going to say that that would be a way that I would like to begin. I would like to write that that way. That's all I really wanted to say. That sounds good. Like to be improvising more, or maybe I do improvise, but I have a tendency to. There's a more kind of desperate improvisation that's happening. So these are possible goals for me.
Yeah. Well, okay. So as I said in my introduction, I think that, I know that both of you guys are really interested in sentences. So I was kind of thinking like, I don't know, it seems like a sentence kind of gives our thoughts like a shape or a direction, right? Like we have all these things going on in our heads. Full words, half sentences, images, gestures, abstract patterns are all kind of going on. And then we try to express something. We need to use language, and English, for example, forces us to organize our thoughts in a certain way. In English, like the pattern is subject, verb, predicate. And so I was curious whether you guys think that sentences have a kind of shape. And I guess I was thinking about this, especially about Renee, just because of her recent interest in drawing. And I guess what is sometimes called asemic writing. So marks that look like writing, but contain no semantic content. So for you guys, like, do sentences have shapes? Do the shapes of these sentences inform the shape of a story? Do they limit the shape a story can take?
I have to first say that while I appreciate asemic writing and thinking, I don't necessarily identify my drawings with that, because for me, drawing is really caught up in writing. I would never want to sort of separate it from meaning. So even though I'm making these marks and these surfaces that sort of look like script that's not entirely legible, I feel like there are other aspects of writing and meaning that are happening that are really important to me. And I'm sort of like in this kind of argument with asemic writing, which may not even be true. I mean, I may just be being too literal with what like with what the word means. But to me, I would never want that notion of meaning, or like the possibility of meaning, to be removed from the visual work. But I love this. I mean, I love thinking about sentences and shape. I think about the piece that I read this evening. Well, I have to say that I just finished a book that's called Plans for Sentences. And the plans for sentences are actually drawings, but I also wrote text to accompany the drawings, and those are called descriptions of future sentences. And they're all written in the future tense. And what I feel when I read them and when I'm editing them is that that they are supposed to be these containers and descriptors for things that are not actually there. So it'll say like, these sentences will cluster, they will grain, and this is like in conversation with the drawings. And so I feel like what I've been working on lately, as I said, is this idea of like the working on trying to sort of get in touch with or define the thing that hold, like the shape or the architecture that holds the language, or which the funnels the language through. And I feel like this book is a way in which I can actually sort of play around with that shape and with the shapiness of writing. And I think of this similar with that piece about space. Space is something flowing, like that to me. It could be like content in itself, but it also seems to me like a way of kind of carving into the linguistic space for something else to kind of go through it. So yeah, I mean, the sentence is like my unit for so many things. Thinking about the container for experience, and how we are moving through language is this kind of series of events and detours and interruptions, etc. So yeah, I mean, I could talk about the sentence for hours upon hours. But what do you think about the sentence, Lucy?
Uh, well, I'm trying to work on writing sentences. I guess for me, I'm a lot of the time I'm dealing with too many options. Which is, when I go to begin a sentence, I experience the sentence as a sound before I write it. And so, to the extent that sounds are spatial, it's spatial for me. But for me, it's an experience of like hearing a lot of possible language and a lot of points of view. And what I tend to try to do with the sentence is kind of make a selection. And often I'm trying to discipline myself to say one thing with a sentence. And it would be very easy to have a sentence that's a whole paragraph and that has a lot of digression and a lot of kind of qualification or indirection, which are things that I'm very interested in how they can become the kind of main course of a sentence, even though that's wrong. You're not supposed to do that. But yeah, and it's interesting, Renee, when you were describing your work with the sentence in your new book, I kept trying to convert what you were saying into a sound for myself, or trying to figure out how it can be a sound or how it can function like a sound. But I hadn't. It's interesting because I hadn't really I've never articulated this for myself before, but a sentence is really like a piece of a sound that I've cut off and kind of like tried to groom in some way to make it intelligible.
When you say sound, I mean, are you thinking like a music or a rhythmic sound, or what kind of sound space should we imagine while when you say that the sentence is the sound cut off?
Maybe like the sound, like an abstract sound, like a jet engine, or like a sound that has a lot of um, vibration and a noise, like a noise. I mean, I think of it as a sound, but it's a noisy, very noisy sound. Um, and I think that's where I'm get a lot of materials from a very noisy sound that I know about. Um, so yeah.
Can you talk about the relationship of that? Because that to me sounds really interesting and complex, like in relationship to the text that gets produced. When I think about the sentences in this book, they feel like they have this kind of like calmative, or like either they need to kind of steady the space, or the space. No, I think it's that. I think that like the narrating is the sort of making steady, but the sentences themselves feel sort of like very smooth. So like what is the relationship of that jet noise to the surface of the like the material that you make when you're sculpting the
Yeah,
sentence
I
or the
mean,
paragraph?
I think I just have a very small tool. Like it's a very fragile tool, and so I can only get a little bit of it. And then I just, I try to turn it into something, maybe as you're saying, calming, or something that feels clear in some way. And I suppose that is also calming for me. That process, that it's possible to, translate something that feels very confusing into something that seems, if not to have order, I'm less interested in it having order than it having a kind of simple feeling to it on a certain level, that it feels graspable.
So the sound translates to the feeling in the language.
Yeah,
Indeed.
that it can become something that has different registers that feel, um, often that feel borrowed from something else. That's also something that interests me a lot, to try to imitate language that feels familiar, like the paragraph that you cited that ends with the note about the narrator's mourning. That we've seen that paragraph before, but we haven't seen that paragraph conclude in that way. And so that's something that interests me, particularly because I think that people often do have an expectation to that tropes are, and I'm not super critical of this necessarily, but tropes are important, for how we communicate, how we function as readers. And so I want to work with them, but then I want to do something else with them also, because of my noise or whatever it is. Yeah, and I wanted to say something also, Renee. I like that you use the verb counted in your piece, was something that was an occasion for a lot of thought for me when I was thinking about how the piece is constructed. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about why you chose that verb, as opposed to other verbs you could have chosen.
Yeah. So I was invited to write a piece in response to this artist's work, and I wanted to write it as an experience as opposed to like a knowing, because I don't I love to write in conversation with art, but I don't want to write about it as if I understand what it's doing, or understand the materials in any deep way. And the sculptor, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, Getty Siboni. He makes these really wonderful kind of architectural installation spaces. So like a big part of what you see is like a corridor that's been kind of highlighted or shifted in a way depending on sort of like shadows and other pieces that are there. But to me, it's very minimalist. And so being in that space, or I wasn't there, I had to look at photographs, felt like this kind of like everything else for me, where it was a way of sort of like being in language or being inside kind of like the narrative of experience, which is like this corridor or this room or this building. And so I think a part of trying to understand that and give that language and try to sort of talk about what shadows were doing, what light was doing, it felt to me like one of the things one does is one counts, like you build what you're seeing by accounting for it or naming it. And that felt really important as a way of kind of creating this experience, this kind of immersive experience. And it's not a word I think that I use very much actually in writing, because it almost feels like too strong of an action for what my narrators are normally doing. But it felt really important. And also what I'm counting ends up being like colors. And I sort of love that there's a little bit of a slip between that and like what it means to be counting colors in relation to this space that is like more of a kind of neutral architecture than it is sort of like specific objects that have, kind of like qualities or characteristics. So yeah, so I didn't think about it super hard because that's not the way I write, but it felt important in that kind of repetition to sort of land in that place and follow it. Yeah, interesting. I'm still thinking about the noise. I just like I like what that does to the kind of dimension of like what we think, where we think thoughts are, like where they come from, or not thoughts as these like itemized objects, but like thinking itself. And I always love the idea of thinking about the space before articulation being like a completely other kind of space than the one that is language, or the one that is the page, or or the story, like whatever you're kind of pulling that into, and just sort of like thinking about that threshold where where it changes, like where your noise, your tiny bit of jet noise has to kind of shift and it has to become visual, also because it's written language. And so I just think that's really fascinating to think about what that does to the work that emerges out of that, the words that you put together and the content of what you're saying.
Is that threshold something that you're able to identify for yourself, Renee, or is it just sort of like I don't know, I don't even know what to call it, I
think about it all the time because I think that's what drawing does for me, is it really brings me closer to these threshold moments, because when I'm writing, it's always a link to some other way of being, or like mode of perception. So because I wrote for let's say 20 years, let's say 20, no, let's say 10 years. I wrote 10 years before I started drawing at all. And then I wrote like almost 15 or 18 years before this kind of drawing that I'm doing now really kind of became something that felt really important that I needed to pursue. And so whenever I went to what was like the thinking space to me, it was always like flooded with writing and what it means to write and the feeling of writing. And so when I began to draw, like the drawing to me sort of sat in that same place. So I was always, it just felt so familiar to writing, drawing. And then feeling those things be present at the same time, then of course led me to want to write about that, which is a lot of what I did in the last part of Calamities, is writing about this relationship between writing and drawing. But I also am drawing with the idea that I'm making scores and the idea that I can give these drawings to a composer and get something back from them, from a space that I can't access through language. So and then the presence of the math in the drawings also is this other kind of threshold between this kind of like elsewhere that pressures and influences the page without being present. So I feel like I'm like all the time sort of working along these thresholds, because I mean, even in prose, because you know, what you're saying earlier, Lucy, about like the this kind of essay voice or feeling arriving in fiction, it just seems so like ordinary at this point that all the kind of like boundaries are open between these places. It's so natural that you would be in an essay and like begin to like embellish or lie or like, you know, tell a fiction inside that space, and that is really important to the shaping of what you're doing. So that's a long way of saying yes, thresholds are very important to me.
Well, kind of unbelievably, it's already 8:10, so I wanted to,
Holy moly.
yeah. I wanted to just open it up and remind people that they can post questions in the chat, and we already have one here, which I'll read out from Thomas, who's one of our contributors. One of the conceits of mid-century modernists was to attribute to space itself the visual and physical motion of people through it, as if space were to flow rather than its occupants, as if it were water, not air, or not even the element of air, but the abstract Cartesian array in which the air itself and all else sits. I wonder what both amazing writers think of this attribution of a quality of the experience of the user, observer, character, narrator to a quality of the environment.
Can you read the first sentence of that beautiful question again?
Yeah. One of the conceits of mid-century modernists was to attribute to space itself the visual and physical motion of people through it, as if space were to flow rather than its occupants, as if it were water, not air. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. That seems right. That seems right. I mean, that's sort of what, and often what a narrator does, something like that. In that they, as the saying goes, they are unreliable. So we have to rely upon them, and it's their movement that is giving the space its qualities and forms. So, I think I can only say yes in response to that question.
I still feel like I don't understand the question, but I think it's also because it's like usually I'm almost going to bed at this time. But it makes me just like the beautiful words that feel like they should just sort of be on their own. But then also Lucy's response makes me think of, I like to think about the commotional field, which is a term I got from, oh God, it's too late for me to remember. These theorists who work on geography and dance talk about space being commotional, and I like the idea that I think that sort of encompasses the idea that as we move through, space changes us and we change space, and that it kind of acknowledges this idea that if we don't see things as being static, or we see things as like as constantly becoming other things, and us becoming other things, to me it makes the space in which narrative occurs just a lot more electric and also a lot less dependable. And I just love the idea of it being okay, that those spaces are shifting and not dependable. And I don't need them necessarily to be repaired, for my ingestion. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You're welcome, Thomas. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank
Does
you.
anyone else have questions?
Oh, is there something else? No, there's not.
No.
Okay. Well, I would maybe as a final question, I mean, I have more, but I feel as though it's late, and Renee is up past the time.
Almost.
She normally is almost. But yeah, maybe just for fun, I would love to hear what you guys are looking at these days, and if art, in terms of visual art, and whether or not that's making its way into your writing or not.
There's another question that just
Oh,
appeared.
wow. There's some more questions. Sorry. Okay. Oh, wow. Is there only one city, or do all spaces become are already one?
Who are these people?
That's an anonymous.
I think a cat wrote that question. But that's okay. I'm always here to answer the questions of cats.
Philosophers.
Yeah. They're very important questions. So, well, I guess I don't know if there's only one city. I guess I feel that cities still have distinct qualities about them, but it sounds like you're talking about a pressure for all space to be virtual in some sense, and therefore synthetic, unified, maybe standardized in some way. I mean, I like to try to find ways to evade standardization, and that's where my interest in many like eccentric parts of the language we have, or like of the English that we have, comes from. So I don't know if all spaces are already one, and maybe I would be okay with them not being already one. That's my response.
I think that it would be impossible for anything to be one at this point. I don't know if it was ever possible. Yeah, I don't know, but I'm looking, because of Zoom, like you have to figure out what to do with your laptop and like how high it should be so that like you don't have the double chin, or that you look your best. And so I really enjoy figuring out which books to use to create my height. And so I have Joni Mitchell, Her a retrospective just came out, which is really exciting because I've been looking for, like, I wanted a big book of her paintings, um, and an Etel Adnan book and Ava Hess. And the thing that for me connects these three people, or their work is so totally different, is that I really love what they all do with color. And color is this thing that's like kind of new to me. It's not new, but it's sort of it's extra in the drawing, you know, because if I'm talking about drawing as writing, color doesn't necessarily fit into that. And so I look at them and I learn about how color can just totally change a space, or like how it holds all of this kind of emotion and ideas of like intimacy and stuff inside of it. And so I love these three people right now, and that's who I'm standing on.
Cool. Oh, we have another question. Exciting. It's in the chat. Okay, Lucy. Well, first he says, "Thank you for such a brilliant conversation." Lucy talked about the sound of a jet engine in relationship to her sentences. Renee mentioned the idea of her drawings acting as potential scores. Renee, do you ever associate any kinds of sounds with these drawings as scores, or are the marks awaiting musical attributes? Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love music. I don't play any music and I don't read any music. And I don't feel like I'm a kind of person. I mean, I'm constantly singing, but it's because of things that I'm listening to. But for me, I do collaborate with a composer, musician, Mauricio Polly, and I spent some time with one of his scores, and I just really kind of noticed the way that the certain letters are used to account for certain pitches or whatever, like pianissimo, and then PP and PPP, which is what I use a lot in the drawings. And sort of, to me, that's what suddenly makes a drawing a score, is when I introduce that notation. But the gift and the excitement is when I can give that to a composer, musician, and they make the sound for me, because I feel like if I knew what the sound was, then I wouldn't make the drawings. But my feeling is, and these are drawings done on black paper, that they're sort of like giving back to me something that I just can't access. And so I feel like if I make a drawing towards a feeling that I have, or like a question that I have, then I give it to that person, they make a sound and give it to me, then like I can read the sound to sort of learn more about that place, like that place of questions. And so I really love that relationship. And I don't know if it's about actually the sound that's produced as much as it is I don't know, the gesture and the idea that someone can find a way to kind of interpret or kind of change the form of these lines into sound. I just, that kind of thing is really exciting to me.
Thank you. Well, actually, we have this one kind of great last question, because I think as the questioner does not realize that we were talking about this poster beforehand, or maybe he does. But Lucy, I guess this is for you. Did you write these stories about looking at the crisp marker poster in the background?
Good eyes.
No, I did not. Only because I don't write while looking at a wall. I always write looking out a window or sitting. I often sit outside and write things wherever I am. So no, I didn't. But maybe that's something to try for another time. Writing while looking at this poster. But this poster has come to thematize all of my Zoom interactions and presentations, and I still don't know what that means. But it is a kind of mark of this period in my life. Not the period of the stories, but the period of their emergence into the world. Yeah. So
congratulations on this book. It's really beautiful.
oh, thank you so much, Renee. That means a lot. And thank you again for being here. And thank you, Sarah, also for being here and for all of your questions. They've been really great.
You guys both for doing this with us. It was really great. Congratulations, Lucy. And Renee, keep us posted on what's next for you.
Well, all right. Are we signing off?
I think so.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.